It all began with a name that was missing from the list. That morning, 20 recruits were supposed to be scheduled for their shooting drills, but only 19 showed up. The instructors double-checked, even called roll twice, but still, no one questioned the older man who was quietly sitting by the edge of the bleachers, sipping from a dented thermos filled with what appeared to be burnt coffee. No one knew who he was. He didn't speak. He didn't wear a badge. No one had even seen him arrive. Some thought he might be maintenance, just a regular guy doing a job. Others joked that maybe he was waiting for his grandson, but that was all. No one bothered to ask. Before we go further, let me ask you something from the heart. Are you ready to help us honor those unsung heroes who've sacrificed so much in silence? If you believe stories like these, raw and powerful, deserve to be shared, hit that subscribe button and help keep them alive. What's unfolding here isn't just a story, it's a reminder of the quiet legends among us, waiting to be noticed. When the drills began, the man was barely noticed. He sat there, still and silent, in his plain green ball cap pulled low over his face. His faded black windbreaker and worn-out jeans made him seem like an outsider who wandered in from the wrong base at the wrong time. His presence felt oddly out of place, but no one gave it much thought. After all, it wasn't unusual for older men to hang around, especially if they had family in training or were part of base operations. The recruits were in their 5th week of training at the SEAL compound in Coronado. They were past Hell Week and just beginning to feel the first stirrings of confidence, with a little swagger to go with it. Most of them still had bruises on their forearms and blisters on their feet, but they had survived the toughest part, and it was time to start having a little fun again. They had earned the right to joke, right? Right. And the shooting drills they had lined up for the day were supposed to be straightforward, nothing special, just live-fire exercises, timed precision shots, and targets at varying distances. In short, something that would feel more like an actual operation, finally. The atmosphere was tense, not in a bad way, but in that, we've got this, kind of way. They were gearing up for a morning of drills that were supposed to challenge their abilities and push their limits. But that old man by the bleachers, sipping his coffee, he had a presence, an unspoken weight to him that the recruits couldn't shake off. And maybe that's why, after a while, a few of them began to whisper among themselves. Who's that guy? I don't know, man. Probably some logistics guy. Did he really bring a thermos to the range? The whispers turned into chuckles, but no one said anything more, at least not in a way that was too loud. It wasn't malicious, not at first. It was just the kind of harmless teasing young men engage in when they don't realize they're being observed by someone who might have seen a lot more than they ever would. Chief Larson, the lead instructor, didn't acknowledge the man. He stuck to his routine, barking out commands and reminders like clockwork. Timing, distance, chamber checks, and the expected grouping on each target. The recruits repeated the instructions, nodded their heads, and fell into formation. Not a single recruit asked about the old man. Not a single one interrupted. And still, the man sat there, unmoving, unreadable, like a statue someone had forgotten to place there. His silence wasn't eerie, though. It wasn't unsettling. It was just, there. Then, one of the younger recruits, Ramirez, couldn't help himself. As they stood in their firing lanes, he leaned toward his buddy and muttered loud enough for a few people to hear, "That guy's probably here to see what not to do." The few recruits who overheard this burst out laughing. There was no malice in it, just the typical cocky humor of men who think they know everything. But even so, the old man didn't react. Not a glance, not a word. He didn't even move as the rifles began to crack one after another, each shot ringing out across the range. It was almost as if the man were completely impervious to the noise, the energy, and the chaos around him. His stillness was oddly calming, but also, unsettling. One instructor, Chief Maddox, a former sniper turned evaluator, glanced over at the man, his gaze lingering just for a fraction of a second. For that brief moment, something seemed familiar about him, but Maddox couldn't place it. A fleeting thought, maybe a memory. He looked away and refocused on the drills. The recruits were starting to sweat now, their faces reddened by the rising sun as the fog burned off and the air began to clear. They were in the zone, pushing through the timed drills, the pressure mounting with each round fired. Some recruits were nailing the targets with precision. Others were faltering, letting the nerves take hold, making mistakes. The instructors barked out corrections, gave feedback, and recorded the times. But the old man didn't move. He just sat there, sipping his coffee, watching. It wasn't until one of the recruits, Ramirez again, had a misfire that something finally shifted. As Ramirez turned from the line, clearly frustrated, he glanced toward the old man on the bleachers and raised his voice just loud enough for the others to hear. "Hey, old-timer. Enjoying the show? Want me to autograph your hearing aid?" His friends laughed, but the old man didn't react. No flinch. No movement. Nothing. And then, for a brief moment, something changed in the air. It wasn't a loud shift, but it was enough that a few recruits, just a few, felt it. They glanced at the man, unsure, as if a tiny crack had appeared in the space between them and the old stranger. It was subtle, but it made some of them uncomfortable, and the humor began to fade. Chief Maddox, who had been watching from the side, paused again, his mouth half open, like he was trying to recall something he couldn't quite remember. Larson, too, glanced up from his clipboard, then quickly went back to his notes. But something had definitely changed in the air, like the calm before a storm, the feeling of something important about to happen. Finally, the man moved. It was a slow, deliberate motion, almost imperceptible. He reached down, not for a rifle, not for a radio, but for his thermos. He took a sip from it, and in that moment, the sleeve of his jacket shifted just enough to reveal a patch. It was faded, worn from years of time and sunlight, but unmistakable to anyone who had ever seen it before, the SEAL trident. The insignia. The symbol of the Navy SEALs. It was old, weathered, and worn down, not the fresh, clean patch of someone new to the team, but the mark of someone who had lived and fought and earned that badge in the hardest of ways. The recruits didn't notice, but both Maddox and Larson did. They exchanged a look. Neither said a word, but the unspoken message between them was clear: this day was not going to go according to plan. As the drills continued, the wind picked up and the sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the targets and casting sharp shadows across the range. But while the recruits continued with their rounds, their attention started to drift back to the man, who hadn't moved an inch. Maddox was no longer watching the recruits. His gaze kept returning to the figure in the windbreaker. That insignia on his sleeve was unmistakable. It was the kind of patch that belonged to someone who had earned it long ago and had never needed to explain it. The kind of insignia worn by men who had seen things most others never would, and survived. Larson, meanwhile, approached the man quietly, clipboard in hand, and his voice was soft. "You here to observe, or should I clear the deck?" The man turned his head. His eyes were clear, unflinching, steel-gray eyes that held no fear. No intimidation. Just calm. "I'm just watching," he replied, his voice dry but firm, unwavering. It didn't demand respect, but it had a weight that assumed it. Larson nodded, hesitated for a moment, but said nothing more. From that moment on, the atmosphere shifted. The recruits began to glance at the man more often. The jokes stopped. The laughter faded. Even Ramirez, who had been so full of cocky bravado, began to reload with a little more care. But, as it often happens under pressure, cracks began to show. When the fifth recruit tripped over his sling and fired into the gravel, the tension in the air snapped. The instructors rushed in, shouting orders to clear the line, check chambers, and ensure everyone was safe. No one was hurt, but the mood soured quickly. The embarrassment lingered, turning into frustration, and that frustration turned into a collective unease. And that's when it happened. The man stood up. He didn't rush. He didn't speak. He simply walked toward the firing line, his boots crunching on the gravel with a deliberate sound that felt louder than it should have been. Larson stepped forward, his hand raised halfway in protest. "Sir, this is a live-fire zone." But the man didn't stop. He paused just before the threshold, close enough for everyone to see the faded trident on his sleeve. His eyes swept over the recruits. His voice, when it came, was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a knife. "You said the record still stands, right?" Larson blinked. "Which record?" 10 and 10, the man replied, "Steel plates, 3 distances, under 15 seconds. Maddox's mouth opened slightly. "That record hasn't been touched in 8 years. The man nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I know." There was a long, drawn-out silence, the kind that feels like a vacuum, the kind that makes your heart race just a little. A few of the younger recruits laughed nervously, thinking this was all some instructor's joke. But Larson didn't laugh. Maddox didn't blink. The moment was sacred, and everyone could feel it. The man walked past them, toward the rifle on the stand, a standard-issue M110, unmodified, nothing special. He picked it up like it weighed nothing, chambered around, and without a single word, prepared himself for the shot. This wasn't a test. This wasn't a drill. This was something else entirely. Something no one had seen coming. He stepped onto the firing line without a single word. No fanfare, no warm-up, no elaborate adjustments. Unlike the others, he didn't fiddle with his scope, didn't pace back and forth to control his breathing, didn't make any sort of performance out of it. He just planted his feet firmly in the dirt, leveled the rifle, and let his body settle into a stance that didn't look like training. No, this didn't look like training at all. It looked like something much deeper, something instinctual. It looked like memory, like the calm of muscle memory born from years of survival, of real battles fought, like home. Behind him, the atmosphere shifted. The air itself felt heavier, like the world was holding its breath. The recruits, who had been joking just moments ago, leaned forward. Even the instructors stopped writing, as if they had realized that something unusual was happening. Phones trembled in the hands of the young men who had been too busy documenting every move on the range to notice that, suddenly, they were witnessing something different. Something that couldn't be captured in a picture or a video. And when Larson finally called, "Shooter ready," the man didn't answer with words. He didn't need to. He gave a single nod, sharp and crisp, as if to say, "I'm ready. Let's go." The buzzer sounded, and the silence that followed was deafening. The first shot rang out, clean and crisp, the metallic sound of it echoing across the range. The second shot was almost immediate, a perfect follow-up before the first even had a chance to fade. Target 3 fell almost as soon as the second shot was fired. The man didn't flinch. His movements were smooth, precise, like a well-oiled machine. His elbows didn't jerk wildly, his shoulders didn't roll in awkward ways. It wasn't about speed. It wasn't about bravado. Every shot was a whisper of motion, a breath, a simple twitch of his finger. The rhythm wasn't rushed, wasn't chaotic. It was perfect. 4, 5, 6, each shot dead center, each one falling with a satisfying ring of steel hitting its mark. The man's focus was unwavering. And then, before anyone could blink, he reloaded. Just 5 seconds. That was it. No hesitation. No wasted motion. He slammed the second mag in with the kind of familiarity that only someone who had done this 1,000 times could manage. It wasn't mechanical. It was the kind of motion that only comes when you've relied on it to stay alive. 7, 8, 9, each shot rang out, echoing perfectly into the stillness. Then, with a small adjustment to his sights, a brief glance to check the wind, he squeezed the trigger for the final shot. 10. The last plate rang out with a clarity that seemed unnatural, like the range itself was holding its breath for that final sound. The buzzer chirped, and the rifle lowered. For a split second, the world stood still. No one moved. The clock on the screen behind the line blinked, 13.2 seconds. A full second and a half faster than the previous record. No misses. No hesitation. No retakes. Just pure precision. Just silence. Just steel. Larson stood frozen, staring. His eyes wide. Maddox exhaled slowly, like he had just witnessed something sacred. Something that couldn't be explained by any amount of training or preparation. The recruits, on the other hand, didn't cheer. They couldn't. They didn't know how. One of the youngest recruits, who had been joking moments before, finally whispered, "Who the hell is this guy?" The man set the rifle down on the bench as gently as if it were a priceless artifact, his movements slow and deliberate. He turned, gave a single nod to Larson, and then began walking back across the range. He didn't ask for applause. He didn't even glance back. He simply walked away, as if nothing had happened, as if the world hadn't just witnessed something extraordinary. As he passed the line of recruits, not a single one dared to meet his eyes, not out of shame, but out of awe. Their gaze was too full of respect, too full of a quiet understanding of what had just occurred. And when the man reached the bleachers, he picked up his thermos as if it were any other day. He took another sip, sat down, and waited as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Like the day had just begun. But the range didn't return to normal. No one moved to replace the targets. No one dared step back onto the line. For the first time in weeks, there was absolute silence, a silence that wasn't born from obedience or fatigue, but from something deeper. Something inside the recruits had shifted, and they couldn't quite name it yet. Some stood with their arms crossed, trying to hide the impact of what they had just witnessed. Others simply stared at the ground, lost in thought. Even Ramirez, always the first to crack a joke, was silent. His usual bravado was gone. He just watched the man on the bench, his posture different now, no longer defiant, no longer cocky, but something that was close to reverence. Maddox, as usual, was the first to break the spell. Slowly, he approached the firing bench, his eyes still glued to the rifle. His hand brushed over the chamber of the gun, and he looked toward Larson. His voice was barely a whisper as he said, "That's not muscle memory." He paused, searching for the right words. "That's something else." Larson didn't respond. He didn't need to. His face said it all. He was already walking toward the bleachers, where the man was sitting. The older man looked up as Larson stopped in front of him, but there was no pride in his expression. No challenge. No expectation. Just a calm, quiet confidence. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't showmanship. It was the calm of someone who had already done what they came to do. Larson hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Why today?" he asked, his voice low, trying to understand the deeper reasoning behind what had just happened. The man looked out at the range, where the last plate still swung in the breeze, moving gently back and forth. "Because I wanted to see if I still could," he said, his voice not boastful, but simple. Honest. It was almost like a confession, a quiet admission that, in spite of everything, he still had it. Still, Larson understood. This wasn't a demonstration. It was a goodbye. A farewell to something deeper than just the range. Back near the line, one of the younger recruits whispered something and pointed. Someone pulled up an old training database, then another. Then Maddox joined in, pulling up archived records. And there it was. The name. Master Chief Evan Cole, SEAL Team 6. Retired 15 years ago. An instructor for advanced marksmanship. Last active record? 2008. One of the recruits read it aloud, his voice trembling with disbelief. Another began cross-referencing, finding commendations, missions, and ghost operations. A legend, whose name had been buried by time and turnover. By the end of the hour, every single recruit knew who he was, not because he introduced himself, not because someone bragged about him, but because when a man performs like that, truth doesn't need a voice. It carries itself. When the range shut down for the day, no one dared approach him. No one spoke to him directly. But as the recruits filtered past the bench on their way to debrief, they couldn't help but acknowledge him. Some nodded. Some said, "Sir." A few offered quiet thank yous. He responded to each of them with a slight, almost imperceptible tip of his head. It wasn't a salute. It wasn't a sign of hierarchy. It was something far more personal, more intimate, a small gesture that carried the weight of something much bigger than just respect. When Ramirez passed, he didn't say a word. He just stopped, met the man's eyes, and gave a single, unpolished salute. The man returned it. Brief, honest, unpretentious. And just like that, Evan Cole walked away. As the sun began to set, he left the compound. His jacket zipped high, his cap pulled low. He didn't take the main exit. He simply disappeared behind the maintenance lot, walking into an area of the base that no one even knew still existed. No one saw a car. No one saw a goodbye. And somehow, that made it feel even more sacred. Even more profound. That night, a new target board was mounted at Lane 3, where that record-breaking shot had been fired. No names. No quotes. Just one simple line engraved in brass, 13.2 Cole. And in the weeks that followed, everything changed. The laughter at the range grew quieter. Recruits began to take their time with their reloads. They started paying attention to the wind, to the small details that mattered. They stopped rushing through their drills. They stopped mocking what they didn't understand. Evan Cole never returned to the range. But somehow, he never really left. Some legends don't need monuments. They don't need speeches or medals. They don't need stories carved in stone. Sometimes, all it takes is one moment, one perfect shot, one single second to change everything. And that's exactly what he did. Evan Cole came because he needed to answer that quiet whisper inside him that said, "You've got one more in you." And when he pulled the trigger, everything shifted. We spend so much time looking for strength in noise, in swagger, in titles. But the greatest strength is the kind that doesn't ask to be seen. It waits. It listens. It acts when the time is right, and then it disappears without needing credit. That was Evan Cole, a man who didn't try to impress anyone. He didn't try to teach a lesson. He simply did what he had always done, exactly what needed to be done, exactly when it mattered. And in the process, he reminded every recruit there of something far more important than any record or title. He showed them what true discipline looks like. And maybe, just maybe, the next time they step onto that range, they'll think twice before laughing at someone's silence. Maybe they'll slow down. Maybe they'll breathe. And maybe, just maybe, they'll remember the man who left them speechless, and how he changed everything, without saying a single word. In a world where noise often drowns out the meaning behind our actions, it's humbling to witness a moment like that of Evan Cole. He didn't seek validation or demand attention, and yet, his presence was more impactful than any loud boast or show of strength. The greatest strength, I believe, is in the silence, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself, the kind that acts quietly but powerfully when the time comes. In today's society, we're constantly surrounded by the pressure to be loud, to be seen, to outshine others. Social media, influencer culture, and even our workplaces seem to reward the bold and brash. But is that really what defines strength? I think we've forgotten the value of quiet discipline, of doing what needs to be done without fanfare. Evan Cole didn't need to announce his greatness. He didn't need to be a legend. He simply acted when it mattered, and in doing so, left an impact that spoke louder than any words ever could. It's a reminder that we don't need to be at the center of attention to be significant. Sometimes, it's the quietest actions that leave the longest lasting impressions. We need to slow down, listen more, and learn to appreciate the quiet strength in those around us, whether it's in the quiet resolve of someone doing their job without seeking accolades, or in the quiet moments of reflection where we find our own strength. The world may never fully recognize those who walk in silence, but they are the ones who truly shape it. Thanks for joining us on this intense ride. If it resonated, hit subscribe, ring the bell, don't miss out. Here's to the silent sacrifices. Together, we're unstoppable. See you next time.